So my name is Lee Jackson. I'm a historian of Victorian London, essentially, especially social history of Victorian London. I have a website called the Dictionary of Victorian London, which is an encyclopedic database of sources about London. So it has advertisements, newspaper articles, maps, photographs, and so on. I've written historical crime fiction set in Victorian London. I've written a walking guide to Dickens' London. And my last book is called, my most recent book is published by Yale University Press, and it's called Dirty Old London, and it's about the problems London had with sanitation, filth, managing the industrial environment, essentially. The great thing about the Victorian period is there is so much information available. Virtually every newspaper that was written in the Victorian period I can access now through my computer at home, you know. Every book, every novel is there, you know. Libraries are continually digitizing all this material over the last 10 years, and so doing history now is an amazing treasure trove of material that you can delve into that historians 10, 20 years ago, to write the same book, you know, I can write a book now in, say, a year, which would have taken 5 years to research in the past. So the speed, and that sort of ties in a way, because it is, the Victorian period itself is that sort of the beginning of modernity, when everything starts speeding up, you know. Transport starts speeding up, railways, steamboats across the Atlantic, you know. The telegraph goes everywhere instantly. Communication, everything takes off. And so now, it's ironic, we're using these tools to go back to the start and say, what was it like to live in the Victorian city? You know? The thing that I think people forget, and I would say this, but the thing I think people forget is the sheer level of filth in the Victorian city. The Victorians were driven by coal. Coal was everywhere, and particularly in the home. You know, everyone had a coal fire, an open coal fire. And yes, you have lots of factories as well, but also lots of houses pouring coal into the atmosphere. And you know, you have the famous fogs of Victorian London. Everyone knows about that. But the soot, the small particles of dirt, were everywhere constantly. You know, you needed to wash your face and hands if you could, several times a day if you wanted to look decent in the Victorian city. You know, ladies, well-off ladies, rich ladies, will wear veils, and it was to keep the dirt off their faces. You know, the streets were covered with horse dung. At the end of the century, there were 300,000 working horses in Victorian London, you know, and you can imagine the results of that. And they just could not keep up with the sheer level of filth that was being produced. Sanitation was the great Victorian problem. They solved it with a massive sewer network in the 1860s, but even so, there were still vast problems with that. There were vast problems with rubbish collection. Nobody wanted to take away the capital's rubbish after the middle of the century. There was just too much of it, and you couldn't make it pay. You had to move it. It cost money, and the local authorities at the time, the public bodies at the time, they didn't want to pay. The idea that you should pay, you know, actually have to pay to take rubbish away, no, it's ridiculous. Who's going to pay for it? And so often it comes down to money as well. There wasn't the organisation, but also people were very unwilling to pay for things we now take for granted as sort of a civic or municipal sort of thing. So there was this sort of penny pinching aspect to the Victorians as well. You know, they didn't want to spend money unnecessarily. So there is the dirt everywhere. There's dirt in the atmosphere. My favourite example is they used to graze sheep still in the parks. So there was sheep grazing in Regent's Park. I don't know who owned them, but there was some small holdout. And it was said you could tell how long the sheep had been in the park by their colour, because they went from white to black over a period of days, you see. So that sort of feel, we know about that dirt, I guess. I guess we also forget how modern the Victorians were in some ways. There's some classic examples of things that we don't associate with the Victorians. Roller skating is the Victorian craze in the 1870s, roller skating rinks. And we're talking, you know, ladies in their full outfits with bustles, but skating on marble, actually, generally. Marble rinks, so quite hard if you fell. Ten-pin bowling, American craze, comes in the 1860s. So these are all things we would think of as 1950s Americana. Cocktails, American cocktails, come to London in the 1860s. And so there's things that seem out of place and out of time. And there's also these sort of threads where you see the modern age happening from, you know, communications technology onwards. And so there's that weird mixture of familiar and unfamiliar, which is what I sort of love about Victorian City. You know. They're expanding, you know, because this is what's happening with London all the time. it's to do with money. Money drives the growth of London. It's money coming in from the British Empire. It's the flow of goods through London. We're sitting now where the docks used to be, and this was every possible raw material in the world, from rubber to ostrich feathers. It all came to here and was housed in warehouses, vast warehouses, and people making such amounts of money. And yet, of course, the money on which wealth was built was often, on the labour of the poor. We're talking about rubbish. There was a massive, at the start of the century, when the fields were near enough to the centre of London, there was a massive rubbish recycling industry, because they would recycle little bits and pieces, but they actually sold. The main element of rubbish was dust, which was ashes from the fires. That was the main, because coal was everywhere. So ashes and cinders, were loads of ashes and cinders. And they could be used in brick making. And so at the start of the century, you could take the cinders from the household fires, take them into the countryside, the clay, make bricks, bring the bricks back into London, build out London a little bit further, take the ashes and cinders. And so that was the rubbish industry. And there were some people who became millionaires from collecting rubbish. And yet their wealth, and literally millionaires, and yet their wealth was based on both the dustmen collecting the rubbish, and get this, the dustmen's wives who worked on these vast rubbish heaps, sieving the material to get the best bits of coal and ash out. Imagine, and this was their job, knee deep, waist deep, day in, day out, for like 10 hours a day, just shaking rubbish and taking it. And so you have these vast gaps between wealth between the West End and the East End. But what connects them actually is the industry, because that's where the money comes from, on the backs of actually the working poor. My favourite thing about the game, about being in the game, is to be able to go places that you never can go. So not only going back in time, but like today, I climbed Nelson's column. And I'm sitting there holding on to Nelson by the shoulder, excuse me. And so it's that thing of being able to explore the city. The reason I do history is because I want to explore Victorian London. And the game gives you that extra amazing dimension to it. Well, no, it's not exactly the same, but it gives you an amazing overview. And it really is a whole layer of history and there's so much detail and accurate history in the game as well. It's a marvelous experience just to immerse yourself in that. So I guess that's it. That's the answer.